The autumn wind howled through the narrow streets of Florence as Niccolò Machiavelli sat in his modest study, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across his weathered face. It was 1513, and the former secretary of the Florentine Republic found himself in exile, stripped of power and fortune, contemplating the brutal realities of political life that had shaped his understanding of human nature and strategic thinking. What he would write in the coming months would forever change how leaders approached power, influence, and survival in an unforgiving world. The parchment before him remained blank, but his mind overflowed with the harsh truths he had witnessed during his years serving the Florentine state. He had seen princes rise and fall, witnessed the delicate dance of diplomacy and war, and observed how the most well-intentioned leaders could be destroyed by their own moral certainties. The lessons he was about to commit to paper would not be comfortable truths, but they would be honest ones, forged in the crucible of real experience and tempered by the cold reality of what actually worked in the pursuit and maintenance of power. As he dipped his quill in ink, Machiavelli reflected on the first and perhaps most fundamental lesson that had shaped his strategic thinking: the world was not as it should be, but as it actually was. This recognition would become the foundation upon which all other strategic insights would rest, a cornerstone that would support the entire edifice of effective leadership in an imperfect world. The first lesson emerged from Machiavelli's observation of Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, whose rise and fall had captivated all of Italy. Borgia understood that effective leadership required a clear-eyed assessment of reality, stripped of wishful thinking and moral platitudes. The lesson was simple yet profound: you must see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. This fundamental shift in perspective demanded that leaders abandon their comfortable illusions about human nature, political dynamics, and the mechanisms of power. Machiavelli had watched countless well-meaning rulers fail because they operated under assumptions about how people should behave rather than how they actually behaved. They expected gratitude from those they helped, loyalty from those they trusted, and honor from those who had never demonstrated it. The strategic mind, Machiavelli realized, must be built upon a foundation of ruthless honesty about human motivation. People acted primarily from self-interest, fear, and ambition. They were capable of great virtue when it served their purposes and profound treachery when virtue became inconvenient. Understanding this was not cynicism, it was simply accurate observation of human behavior across cultures and centuries. Borgia's success had come from his ability to anticipate how others would act based on their actual incentives rather than their proclaimed intentions. When he needed to secure the loyalty of his generals, he did not appeal to their sense of honor or duty. Instead, he ensured that their personal success was inextricably linked to his own, making betrayal a path to their own destruction. When he needed to eliminate threats, he did not rely on their good intentions or hope they would voluntarily withdraw from the political arena. He acted decisively to remove them from the equation entirely. This realistic assessment extended beyond individuals to institutions, alliances, and entire political systems. Machiavelli observed that republics, principalities, and kingdoms all operated according to predictable patterns of behavior that had little to do with their stated ideals and everything to do with the fundamental dynamics of power, resources, and human nature. A leader who understood these patterns could navigate them successfully. One who ignored them in favor of wishful thinking was doomed to failure. The second lesson built naturally upon this foundation of realism: fear is more reliable than love, but hatred must be avoided at all costs. This insight came from Machiavelli's analysis of various rulers and their relationships with their subjects. He had observed that leaders who relied primarily on being loved found themselves vulnerable to the fickleness of human emotion and the changing tides of fortune. Love, while pleasant to experience, was fundamentally unstable as a basis for political power. It was voluntary, temporary, and dependent on circumstances that were often beyond a leader's control. When times became difficult, when sacrifices were required, or when competing interests emerged, love could evaporate with startling speed. The citizens who cheered a leader during prosperous times might just as quickly turn against them when faced with hardship or uncertainty. Fear, by contrast, was reliable and enduring. It did not depend on the emotional state of the subjects or their assessment of the leader's recent performance. A leader who was feared would be obeyed regardless of whether the subjects felt particularly fond of them at any given moment. Fear created a consistent incentive structure that made rebellion costly and compliance the path of least resistance. However, Machiavelli's insight went deeper than a simple endorsement of intimidation as a leadership strategy. He understood that there was a crucial distinction between fear and hatred, and that crossing the line from one to the other could be fatal for a leader's long-term survival. Fear could coexist with respect and even grudging admiration, but hatred was pure emotional poison that would eventually destroy any political relationship. The art lay in inspiring the right kind of fear, the kind that recognized the leader's power and determination without creating a burning desire for revenge. This required precision in the application of force, carefully calibrated responses to challenges, and an understanding of which actions would be seen as necessary firmness versus which would be perceived as cruelty or injustice. Machiavelli had seen leaders who understood this balance maintain power for decades, while others who either relied too heavily on love or who crossed into hatred found their reigns cut short by rebellion, assassination, or political maneuvering. The successful leader inspired fear of the consequences of opposition while maintaining enough restraint and strategic wisdom to avoid creating implacable enemies bent on revenge. The third lesson emerged from Machiavelli's understanding of how power actually functioned in practice: it is better to be both feared and loved, but, if you must choose, being feared is more effective than being loved alone. This refined the previous lesson by acknowledging that the ideal situation involved combining respect, affection, and healthy fear into a complex emotional response that maximized both loyalty and compliance. However, the reality of leadership often forced choices between competing approaches, and, in those moments of decision, Machiavelli argued that fear provided a more solid foundation for lasting power than love alone. This was not because fear was inherently superior to love, but because the political environment in which leaders operated was inherently unstable and unpredictable. The leader who relied primarily on love found themselves at the mercy of external circumstances that could quickly change public sentiment. Economic downturns, military defeats, natural disasters, or the emergence of more charismatic rivals could all undermine a leader's popularity through factors that were largely beyond their control. When love was the primary source of political legitimacy, these external shocks could translate directly into political instability and potential overthrow. Fear, properly applied, created a buffer against such fluctuations. Even when circumstances turned difficult, even when the leader was forced to make unpopular decisions or ask for difficult sacrifices, the foundation of respected authority remained intact. Subjects might not like the decisions, but they would comply with them because the alternative was understood to be worse. The most sophisticated leaders learned to cultivate both emotions simultaneously, creating what Machiavelli saw as the optimal political relationship. They inspired genuine affection through their competence, their victories, and their contribution to the common good, while simultaneously maintaining a reputation for decisiveness and strength that discouraged potential challengers. They were loved when possible and feared when necessary, with the wisdom to recognize which approach was called for in any given situation. This balance required a deep understanding of timing, context, and human psychology. It meant knowing when to show mercy and when to demonstrate strength, when to be accessible and when to maintain distance, when to reward loyalty and when to punish disloyalty. The leader who mastered this balance could maintain power through changing circumstances while building a legacy that would endure beyond their own lifetime. The fourth lesson dealt with one of the most difficult aspects of strategic leadership: you cannot always take the high road and survive. This was perhaps the most challenging truth for leaders who had been raised with strong moral principles or who genuinely desired to rule justly and honorably. Machiavelli had observed that the political arena was not a monastery where virtue was automatically rewarded and evil was promptly punished. Instead, the political world was a competitive environment where moral scruples could become fatal weaknesses if applied without regard for context and consequences. Leaders who were unwilling to bend their principles when circumstances demanded it often found themselves outmaneuvered by more pragmatic opponents who had no such constraints. The result was not the triumph of virtue, but its practical irrelevance in the face of more flexible and adaptable strategies. This did not mean that morality had no place in leadership or that leaders should abandon all ethical considerations. Rather, it meant that effective leaders needed to understand when moral principles served their strategic objectives and when they might conflict with the practical requirements of maintaining power and achieving important goals. The leader who could not make this distinction was likely to accomplish neither moral good nor practical success. Machiavelli had seen leaders destroy themselves and their causes through an inflexible adherence to moral absolutes that were inappropriate for their situation. They would refuse to lie when a strategic deception could save thousands of lives, decline to break a promise when the circumstances that created the promise had fundamentally changed, or hesitate to use force when delay would result in greater suffering for their people. The strategic leader learned to think in terms of consequences rather than simply following rules. They asked not just whether an action was conventionally moral, but whether it would lead to better outcomes for the people and causes they were responsible for protecting. This consequentialist approach required a level of moral sophistication that went beyond simple rule following to genuine ethical reasoning about complex trade-offs and competing values. At the same time, the strategic leader understood that there were lines that should not be crossed, not because of abstract moral principles, but because crossing them would be strategically counterproductive. Certain types of betrayal, cruelty, or injustice would create such lasting resentment and instability that they would undermine the leader's long-term effectiveness regardless of any short-term advantages they might provide. The art lay in distinguishing between moral compromises that were strategically necessary and those that were simply convenient, between flexibility that served important purposes and opportunism that would ultimately prove self-defeating. This required not the abandonment of moral judgment, but its integration with strategic thinking in a way that served both ethical and practical objectives over the long term. As Machiavelli completed this first section of his analysis, he paused to consider how these foundational lessons created the framework for more advanced strategic thinking. The leader who truly understood that the world operated according to predictable patterns of human behavior, who could balance fear and love in their relationships with others, and who could make difficult moral trade-offs when necessary, had developed the basic competencies required for survival in a competitive political environment. But survival was only the beginning. The next phase of strategic development required understanding how to actively shape that environment, how to anticipate and respond to changing circumstances, and how to build the kind of lasting power that could withstand both external challenges and internal threats. These more advanced lessons would build upon the foundation of realism and moral flexibility to create a comprehensive approach to strategic leadership. Part 2, The Art of Strategic Maneuvering. The candlelight had burned lower as Machiavelli continued his writing, and the night air carried the sounds of Florence settling into sleep. But his mind was fully engaged with the more complex aspects of strategic thinking, those lessons that distinguish truly exceptional leaders from those who merely survived. The foundation was important, but the superstructure of advanced strategy was what separated great leaders from merely competent ones. The fifth lesson emerged from his observation of how successful leaders managed the complex web of relationships, alliances, and rivalries that defined their political environment. Your alliances should be based on mutual interest, not sentiment. This insight had crystallized as he watched various princes and republics form partnerships that seemed strong on paper but crumbled when tested by changing circumstances. Machiavelli had observed that political alliances based primarily on personal friendship, shared values, or historical ties were inherently unstable because they relied on factors that could change rapidly and unpredictably. Personal relationships could sour due to misunderstandings or conflicting interests. Shared values could be reinterpreted or abandoned when they became inconvenient. Historical ties could become irrelevant as new generations took power or as the strategic landscape shifted. In contrast, alliances based on clear mutual interest created stable, predictable partnerships that could endure even when the personal relationships between leaders became strained. When both parties understood exactly what they gained from the partnership and what they risked by abandoning it, they could make rational decisions about the alliance's continuation based on changing circumstances rather than emotional reactions. The strategic leader learned to think systematically about what each potential ally had to gain and lose from the partnership. They structured agreements in ways that made cooperation more profitable than defection for all parties involved. They remained alert to changes in their allies' situations that might alter the cost-benefit analysis of the relationship, and they were prepared to adjust the terms of the partnership or even end it when it no longer served mutual interests. This approach required a certain emotional detachment from political relationships that many leaders found difficult to maintain. It meant treating allies as valuable but replaceable assets rather than as permanent friends or family members. It meant being prepared to abandon partnerships that were no longer strategically useful, even when doing so involved personal disappointment or the breaking of sentimental attachments. However, this did not mean that successful leaders were cynical or dishonest in their dealings with allies. On the contrary, the most effective strategic alliances were characterized by clear communication, reliable follow-through on commitments, and a reputation for fair dealing that made others want to partner with them. The difference was that these leaders understood the business-like nature of political partnerships and structured them accordingly. Machiavelli had seen leaders who failed to grasp this principle find themselves repeatedly betrayed by allies who had seemed trustworthy and committed. These leaders had made the mistake of assuming that because someone shared their values or had been helpful in the past, they would continue to be reliable partners regardless of how circumstances changed. When the inevitable betrayal came, these leaders were not just disappointed, they were strategically unprepared for the new reality. The sixth lesson dealt with one of the most critical skills for long-term strategic success: you must learn to read the intentions behind actions, not just the actions themselves. This insight came from Machiavelli's recognition that in the political world, people rarely acted with complete honesty about their motivations, and that understanding what someone was really trying to accomplish was often more important than understanding what they claimed to be doing. This skill required developing a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, political dynamics, and strategic thinking. The successful leader learned to analyze not just what others did, but why they did it, what they hoped to accomplish, and what their actions revealed about their capabilities, resources, and long-term plans. This kind of analysis required looking beyond surface appearances to understand the deeper patterns of behavior that reveal true intentions. Machiavelli had observed that most people were not skilled at concealing their real motivations over extended periods of time. While they might be able to lie effectively about specific facts or hide particular plans, their overall pattern of behavior usually revealed their genuine priorities and objectives. The strategic leader learned to pay attention to these patterns rather than getting distracted by individual statements or actions that might be deliberately misleading. This analytical approach extended to understanding the systemic pressures and incentives that shaped other people's behavior. A strategic leader would ask not just what someone was doing, but what they had to do given their position, their resources, their constraints, and their objectives. Often, understanding these structural factors made it possible to predict how someone would behave even when they themselves might not yet know what they were going to do. The ability to read intentions accurately provided enormous strategic advantages. It made it possible to anticipate challenges before they fully emerged, to identify opportunities that others might miss, and to structure relationships and agreements in ways that accounted for likely future developments. It also made it possible to distinguish between genuine threats and posturing, between temporary setbacks and permanent changes in the strategic landscape. However, this skill required constant practice and refinement. The strategic leader had to remain alert to new information that might change their assessment of someone's intentions, while also avoiding the trap of constantly second-guessing their analysis to the point of paralysis. They needed to develop confidence in their judgment while maintaining the flexibility to revise their conclusions when warranted by new evidence. The seventh and final lesson represented the culmination of Machiavelli's strategic thinking: fortune favors the prepared, but you must be willing to seize opportunities when they arise. This insight combined an understanding of the role that chance and unpredictable events played in political life with recognition of how strategic leaders could position themselves to benefit from uncertainty rather than being victimized by it. Machiavelli had observed that while no leader could control all the circumstances that shaped their environment, successful leaders could influence the probability of favorable outcomes through careful preparation and positioning. They could develop the resources, relationships, and capabilities that would allow them to respond effectively when opportunities arose or when crises demanded action. This preparation involved both concrete measures, building financial reserves, maintaining military capabilities, cultivating a network of allies and informants, and mental preparation that allowed for rapid decision-making and adaptation when circumstances changed quickly. The strategic leader spent time thinking through potential scenarios and developing contingency plans that could be activated when needed. But preparation alone was not sufficient. Machiavelli had also seen leaders who were well prepared but who failed to act decisively when crucial moments arrived. They hesitated, overthought their options, or waited for perfect conditions that never came. Meanwhile, less prepared but more decisive competitors seized the initiative and shaped events to their advantage. The most successful leaders combined thorough preparation with what Machiavelli called virtue, not moral virtue in the conventional sense, but the combination of skill, courage, and adaptability that allowed them to excel in challenging circumstances. They were ready when opportunity knocked, but they were also willing to open the door and invite it in. This balance between preparation and action required a sophisticated understanding of timing and risk assessment. The strategic leader learned to distinguish between situations that called for patience and careful planning versus those that demanded immediate decisive action. They developed an intuitive sense of when delay would improve their position and when it would allow the opportunity to slip away. The interplay between fortune and virtue was dynamic and ongoing. External circumstances constantly shifted, creating new challenges and opportunities that required adaptive responses. The strategic leader understood that their role was not to eliminate uncertainty or control every variable, but to position themselves so that they could benefit from favorable changes while minimizing the damage from unfavorable ones. As Machiavelli reflected on these 7 lessons, he recognized that they formed an integrated system of strategic thinking rather than a collection of independent insights. The ability to see reality clearly provided the foundation for effective decision-making. Understanding the dynamics of fear and love made it possible to build stable relationships with subjects and allies. Moral flexibility allowed for effective action in complex situations where simple rule-following would be inadequate. Building alliances based on mutual interest created lasting partnerships that could endure changing circumstances. Reading the intentions behind actions made it possible to anticipate challenges and opportunities. Combining preparation with decisive action allowed leaders to shape their environment rather than simply responding to it. Part 3, the integration of strategic wisdom. The final hours of the night found Machiavelli in deep contemplation as he approached the conclusion of his analysis. The individual lessons were important, but their true power lay in how they worked together to create a comprehensive approach to strategic leadership. The leader who mastered all 7 lessons would possess a formidable combination of realism, pragmatism, and adaptability that would serve them well in any political environment. The integration of these lessons required understanding how they reinforced and complemented each other in practice. The realism that came from seeing the world as it actually was provided the foundation for all other strategic thinking. Without this clear-eyed assessment of human nature and political dynamics, the other lessons would be built on shifting sand rather than solid rock. This fundamental realism made it possible to understand why fear was more reliable than love as a basis for political relationships. A leader who truly understood how people actually behaved would recognize that emotional attachments were variable and circumstantial, while properly calibrated fear created consistent incentive structures that did not depend on the subject's momentary feelings or recent experiences. The willingness to compromise moral principles when strategically necessary flowed naturally from this realistic understanding of political life. The leader who recognized that the political arena operated according to different rules than private morality would not be paralyzed by conflicts between their personal values and their strategic objectives. They would develop the sophistication to navigate these conflicts in ways that served their larger purposes without abandoning their essential humanity. This moral flexibility made it possible to build alliances based on mutual interest rather than sentiment. The leader who understood that political relationships were fundamentally different from personal friendships would structure partnerships in ways that created stable incentives for cooperation. They would not be disappointed or surprised when allies acted according to their interests rather than their proclaimed affections. The ability to read intentions behind actions drew upon all of these earlier insights. The leader who understood human nature, political dynamics, and the role of interests in shaping behavior would be well equipped to analyze what others were really trying to accomplish. They would not be misled by surface appearances or distracted by deliberate misdirection. Finally, the combination of preparation and decisive action represented the active application of all previous lessons. The leader who understood reality, managed relationships effectively, navigated moral complexities, built strategic alliances, and read intentions accurately would be well positioned to take advantage of opportunities when they arose. They would have developed both the resources and the wisdom needed to shape events rather than simply reacting to them. But the integration of these lessons went beyond their logical connections to encompass the practical challenge of applying them consistently over time. Strategic leadership was not a matter of occasional brilliance but of sustained excellence across changing circumstances and evolving challenges. This required developing what Machiavelli thought of as strategic habits, ways of thinking and acting that became second nature and could be relied upon even under pressure. The strategic leader learned to automatically assess new situations through the lens of realistic expectations rather than wishful thinking. They developed instinctive responses to challenges that balanced firmness with restraint, inspiring appropriate levels of fear without crossing into hatred. They became comfortable with moral complexity and learned to make difficult trade-offs without losing sight of their larger objectives. They built and maintained networks of relationships based on clear mutual benefits, regularly reassessing these partnerships as circumstances changed. They developed sophisticated analytical skills that allowed them to understand not just what was happening around them, but why it was happening and what it might lead to. They cultivated both the patience needed for effective preparation and the decisiveness required for timely action. The development of these strategic habits required practice, reflection, and continuous learning from experience. The strategic leader understood that mastery was not a destination but an ongoing process of refinement and adaptation. They remained alert to new challenges that might require novel approaches while building upon the foundation of proven principles that had served them well in the past. Machiavelli also recognized that the application of these lessons would vary depending on the specific context in which a leader operated. The particular challenges faced by a prince differed from those confronting the leader of a republic, just as the strategies appropriate for wartime differed from those needed during peaceful periods. However, the underlying principles remained constant because they were based on fundamental aspects of human nature and political dynamics that transcended specific institutional arrangements or historical circumstances. The strategic leader learned to adapt these principles to their particular situation while maintaining their essential integrity. They understood which aspects of their approach could be modified to fit local conditions and which represented non-negotiable elements that had to be preserved regardless of external pressure or convenience. This adaptability was particularly important because the political environment was constantly evolving, creating new challenges and opportunities that might not have existed when the leader first developed their strategic approach. The principles had to be robust enough to provide guidance in unfamiliar situations while remaining flexible enough to accommodate novel circumstances that could not have been anticipated in advance. The leader who successfully integrated all 7 lessons would possess what Machiavelli considered the essential qualities of effective strategic thinking: clarity about reality, sophistication about human relationships, wisdom about moral complexity, skill in building and managing alliances, insight into others' motivations and plans, and the ability to combine preparation with decisive action when necessary. Such a leader would be formidable not because they were ruthless or amoral, but because they understood how to navigate complex political environments effectively while maintaining their essential humanity and serving the larger interests they were responsible for protecting. They would be strategic not in the narrow sense of being calculating or manipulative, but in the broader sense of being thoughtful, adaptive, and effective in pursuit of important objectives. As dawn broke over Florence, Machiavelli set down his quill and reviewed what he had written. The 7 lessons represented distillations of wisdom gained through years of observation, analysis, and practical experience in the challenging world of Renaissance politics. They were not comfortable truths or inspiring platitudes, but honest insights into what actually worked for leaders who had to operate in an imperfect world where good intentions alone were insufficient for success. He understood that these lessons would be controversial and that many would find them disturbing or immoral. The comfortable fiction that virtue was always rewarded and evil always punished was deeply embedded in human thinking, and challenging it would inevitably provoke resistance from those who preferred inspiring myths to uncomfortable realities. But Machiavelli believed that leaders deserved honest guidance rather than comforting illusions. The stakes were too high, the challenges too real, and the consequences of failure too severe to waste time on wishful thinking or moral posturing that ignored the actual dynamics of political life. The leader who truly wanted to serve their people effectively needed to understand how power actually worked rather than how philosophers thought it should work. The 7 lessons were not the complete guide to strategic leadership, but they provided a solid foundation upon which more specific skills and knowledge could be built. They represented the minimum level of strategic sophistication required for survival in a competitive political environment, while also pointing toward the higher levels of mastery that distinguish truly great leaders from merely competent ones. The leader who internalized these lessons would still face difficult decisions, unexpected challenges, and the inevitable frustrations that came with operating in complex social and political systems. But they would approach these challenges with a clear understanding of the fundamental dynamics at work and a proven framework for making decisions that balanced competing considerations effectively. Most importantly, they would understand that strategic thinking was not about abandoning morality or humanity, but about applying moral reasoning in a sophisticated way that took account of the real-world constraints and opportunities that shaped political life. The goal was not to become cynical or amoral, but to become effective in ways that served both immediate practical needs and longer-term ethical objectives. As Machiavelli gathered his papers and prepared to face the day, he reflected on the irony that the hardest lessons were often the most valuable ones. The comfortable truths that people wanted to hear were usually the ones that led them astray, while the uncomfortable insights that challenged their assumptions were the ones that actually helped them succeed. The strategic leader learned to value truth over comfort, effectiveness over popularity, and results over good intentions. The 7 hard lessons would not guarantee success, but they would provide the foundation for strategic thinking that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential integrity. They would help leaders avoid the most common pitfalls that destroyed promising careers and noble causes. Most importantly, they would help leaders develop the sophistication needed to serve their people effectively in an imperfect world where simple solutions were rarely adequate for complex problems. In the years that followed, these lessons would be tested, refined, and applied by leaders facing challenges that Machiavelli could not have imagined. But their fundamental insights into human nature, political dynamics, and strategic thinking would prove remarkably durable, providing guidance for anyone who needed to navigate the eternal challenges of leadership, influence, and power in human affairs. The document that emerged from those long nights of writing would become one of the most influential works in the history of strategic thought, not because it told people what they wanted to hear, but because it told them what they needed to know. The 7 hard lessons would continue to challenge and educate leaders for centuries to come, offering the kind of honest wisdom that could only come from careful observation of how the world actually worked rather than speculation about how it should work. And, in the end, that honest wisdom, uncomfortable as it might be, represented the greatest gift that one strategic thinker could offer to another: the truth about what it really took to succeed in the demanding art of leadership in an imperfect but very real world.